Hi, I'm Thomas Strunk from Xavier University, and I'll be presenting on my poster, I'll Tear Down My Barns, Ancient Catholic Social Teaching. We'll be looking at some passages from early Christians of the 4th century, siblings actually, and we'll begin with St. Macrina. St. Macrina was the eldest child in a remarkable family of 10 children. Her parents were saints as well as several of her siblings, including those who will be mentioned here, Saints Basil and Gregory. She adopted an ascetic lifestyle that seems to have greatly influenced her family. Macrina studied scripture extensively, and she devoted the family's great wealth to founding male and female monasteries. Her brother Gregory wrote a biography of her, as well as an account of her life in the form of a philosophic dialogue. For this reason, she has sometimes been called a Christian Socrates. In his biography, Gregory of Nyssa records a conversation he had with one of Macrina's fellow monks immediately after her death. He writes, "She said, as to all those things which are for the ornamentation of the body, she neither had anything to do with them during her lifetime, nor did she put away any for the present occasion, so that not even if we wanted to, would there be anything more than what we have here to dress her in. But isn't it possible, I asked, to find something in the store cupboards with which we can adorn the bier? In what store cupboards? She replied. You have in your hands everything she put away. Look at her cloak. Look at the veil on her head, the worn sandals on her feet. This is her wealth. This is her fortune." Gregory also writes of a miracle of Macrina's working during a time of famine. For this reason, I pass over that incredible farming miracle at the time of the famine, how the grain was distributed according to need and showed no sign of diminishing, how the volume remained the same both before it was given out to those who asked for it and after the distribution. So here we can see the family's value on feeding the hungry rather than storing up their riches. A value that will also be seen in St. Basil's writings as well. And to him, we turn next. In his efforts to use wealth to promote the greater good. He's the slightly younger brother of Macrina, and he died a few months before her as well. And Basil is one of the giants of Christianity, a doctor of the Catholic Church, one of the 3 great hierarchs of the Eastern churches. He did important work as a scholar. He was classically trained and contributed important teachings to the doctrine of the Trinity. He also advocated for the poor, distributing food during a famine and giving away much of his wealth. He built the Basileid outside Caesarea, which included space for the poor, a hospice, and a hospital. So Basil too demonstrated the importance of using one's wealth for the greater good. And his words here come from a homily on the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verses 16 through 21, on the rich man who wanted to tear down his barns to build bigger ones. Basil writes, "If you want storehouses, you have them in the stomachs of the poor. But now you lower your eyes and quicken your step, muttering hasty responses, lest anyone prize some small coin from your grasp. You know how to say only one thing. I do not have, I cannot give." And then he adds, "The bread you are holding back is for the hungry. The clothes you keep put away are for the naked. The shoes rotting away with disuse are for those who have none. The silver you keep buried in the earth is for the needy. You are thus guilty of injustice toward as many as you might have aided and did not." And then they, the poor, turn their gaze to their own children, thinking that perhaps by bringing them to the slave market, they might find some respite from death. Consider now the violent struggle that takes place between the desperation arising from famine and a parent's fundamental instincts. And you can see there how someone, particularly a poor person, might fall into slavery. It's both a form of bondage, but it's also an economic reality in antiquity and in the modern world. And it's a topic that Basil's brother Gregory would take up in his homily on Ecclesiastes. Gregory, too, studied classical literature and rhetoric, and also was an important writer on establishing the doctrine of the Trinity. He also developed a profound mysticism of darkness, something many might be familiar with through works like The Cloud of Unknowing. And he's one of the few voices from antiquity to speak out publicly against slavery. And here's some of his thoughts on that from his homily on Ecclesiastes. which he begins quoting from. I got me slaves and slave girls. What do you mean? You condemn man to slavery when his nature is free and possesses free will, and you legislate in competition with God, overturning his law for the human species, the one made on the specific terms that he should be the owner of the earth and appointed to government by the Creator. Him you bring under the yoke of slavery, as though defying and fighting against the divine decree. And then he adds, for what price, tell me? What did you find in existence worth as much as this human nature? What price did you put on rationality? How many obols did you reckon the equivalent of the likeness of God? How many staters did you get for selling the being shaped by God? And we can see there a slave tag, which an enslaved person wore, that dates to the 4th or 5th century CE, so roughly contemporaneous with Gregory of Nyssa's writings. We'll also note that the tag has the Chi-Rho symbol on it, indicating that the enslaver was most likely a Christian, and a reminder that slavery did not die out because of the rise of Christianity, and in fact, continued right alongside it. So what? Well, I believe there are 3 important points from these passages. First, early Christians turned to the scriptures for their inspiration and then looked for ways to apply that to their lives and society, and that provides us with a model as well. Second, these voices do not come from the margins of the Christian tradition, but from some of its most influential saints. And lastly, calls for freedom and economic justice have early roots in Christianity. Economic justice is part of the Christian tradition and therefore our tradition as Jesuit colleges and universities. When we advocate for social and economic justice, we're working in a long tradition and from the center of that tradition. So a couple reflection questions to close with. When have we stored up our goods rather than share them with our neighbors in need? When have we seen or used other people as means for ourselves rather than as free and whole persons who have their own purpose in God's plan? How can we, like Saints Macrina, Basil, and Gregory, use our words and actions to be prophetic voices for our own times? I would like to thank the Stephen S. Smith Center of the Williams College of Business at Xavier University for their support for this project, as well as the Center for Mission and Identity. And thank you for listening.